Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je suis mon honorable collègue, le secrétaire parlementaire pour le patrimoine canadien, et je croyais qu'elle avait quelques minutes qui restaient, mais merci beaucoup de m'avoir accordé la chance de parler aujourd'hui. C'est avec plaisir que je prends la parole pour appuyer le projet de loi C5, qui modifie certaines lois de façon à y ajouter un nouveau congé, à savoir la Journée nationale de vérité et de réconciliation. Le projet de loi C5 traite d'une question très importante que tous les membres de cette Chambre prennent très au sérieux. Le système de pensionnat est une tragédie nationale, un produit issu de colonialisme et propulsé par le racisme. Il est important que nous n'oublions jamais ce pan tragique de notre histoire, de même que l'héritage permanent laissé par les pensionnats. Pour cela, nous devons reconnaître cette situation du passé et informer les Canadiens des expériences vécues dans ces écoles par les enfants autochtones. As part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission documented the experience of survivors, families, communities, and those personally affected by residential schools. The Commission presented a final report in 2015 with 94 calls to action to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of reconciliation. Call to Action 80, and let me read it, Madam Speaker, calls upon the federal government, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, to establish as a statutory holiday a national day for truth and reconciliation to honor survivors, their families, and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process. And although Bill C-5 seeks to address Call to Action 80, the Government of Canada remains committed to fully implementing the 76 calls to action that fall under federal responsibility. Dans le cadre de cet engagement, le gouvernement du Canada a franchi une étape importante dans la mise en œuvre de l'appel à l'action 80 de la Commission de vérité et réconciliation en présentant un projet de loi visant à créer une journée nationale de vérité et de réconciliation qui, pour les travailleurs sous réglementation fédérale, sera observé en tant que jour férié le 30 septembre. Le choix de 30 septembre vise à faire correspondre cette journée à la date établie pour la tenue de la journée du chandail orange. La journée du chandail orange consiste à rappeler l'héritage des pensionnats ainsi qu'à favoriser la réconciliation. When it comes to such an important issue, creating a day for truth and reconciliation seems like a small gesture, but I would suggest, Madam Speaker, that it is an important one. It is important because there are too many people, too many communities in this country that continue to suffer from the injustice and stigma of racism. During the current pandemic, we have seen the disproportionate impact of this crisis on racialized people, Indigenous people, immigrant communities, and other vulnerable Canadians. Madam Speaker, recently we have seen racial injustice right before our eyes across the border. The killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis by police shocked many of us. But we also saw the killing of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, Daniel Prude in Rochester, and who can forget what happened a few years ago to Eric Garner in New York? Those brutal killings of Black people by police have shocked our consciousness. But Canadians cannot say that everything is fine in Canada. In my own province of Quebec, in Joliet Hospital, we saw the death of Joyce Ashokwan, an Indigenous woman who live-streamed racist slurs and neglect and abuse while she was in the care of nurses and the staff at a hospital in my own province. This is a tragic example of the racism and intolerance that Indigenous peoples continue to face in Canada. Madam Speaker, it was heartbreaking and beyond unconscionable. And if anyone dares to say that systemic racism does not exist in Canada, they should be ashamed. Comment pouvons-nous établir un climat de confiance, de respect et de compréhension les uns envers les autres? We need to take time to acknowledge the oppression and discrimination Indigenous peoples have experienced in Canada for centuries, and to reflect about the challenges faced by Indigenous communities. The National Day for Truth and Reconciliation will provide federally regulated workers with the opportunity to reflect on this issue and to participate in educational and commemorative activities. In 2018 and 2019, during the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage Study of Private Members Bill C-369 by our former colleague Georgina Jolibois, which sought to make National Indigenous Peoples a statutory holiday, witnesses from Indigenous organizations were in favor of the creation of a statutory holiday to commemorate the history and legacy of residential schools. Now, let me address the legislation itself that would amend the Bills of Exchange Act, the Interpretation Act, and Part 3 of the Canada Labour Code. Part 3 of the Canada Labour Code would be amended to establish the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation as a holiday. It will provide federally regulated private sector employees with a paid holiday. It is on this portion of the bill that I focus. Part 3 of the code covers approximately 955,000 employees and 18,500 employers. It contains provisions setting out minimum labor standards for workplaces in the federally regulated private sector and in most federal crown corporations. It includes important industries such as interprovincial and international transportation, banking, telecommunications, and broadcasting, as well as some government activities on First Nations reserves. Part 3 does not apply to the Federal Public Service, the Canadian Armed Forces, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or to parliamentary employees. But due to existing provisions in all federal public service collective agreements, as well as past practices to extend similar terms of employment to the RCMP and the Canadian Armed Forces, employees in the federal public sector would also be entitled to the new federal holiday. Of course, as we all know, the Government of Canada does not have the constitutional authority to impose a statutory holiday for those employees that fall within the authority of provincial governments. That said, I would like to say a few words about the implementation of this new holiday. Une journée nationale de vérité et de réconciliation donnerait à plus de 955 000 employés du secteur privé assujettis à la compétence fédérale l'occasion de participer à des activités éducatives et commémoratives en lien avec les pensionnats indiens et la réconciliation. Cette journée mettrait aussi en évidence les expériences vécues par les hommes et les femmes des Premières Nations, Inuits et Métis, y compris ceux et celles qui travaillent dans les entreprises du secteur privé assujetties à la compétence fédérale ou dans la fonction publique fédérale. Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement du Canada maintient son engagement à l'égard de la réconciliation et de la mise en œuvre en application intégrale des 76 appels à l'action qui relèvent de la responsabilité fédérale. Reconciliation remains a priority for us, and the introduction of Bill C-5 is a step forward in the healing process for survivors that were harmed under the federally operated residential school system. Madam Speaker, let us work together toward a renewed partnership built on respect, dialogue, and recognition of rights. Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
Question